Hi everyone. How are you all doing? We're good. That's good. Um, I'm from Melbourne. There's a bit of a small football match happening over there. But I feel like this is a bit of a grand final. Having one of the leading sculptors in the world, Thomas J. Price, here with us in Sydney to celebrate his very, very incredible sculpture that's outside. Have any of you seen it, by the way? You have? Good. So this is hopefully going to be an enriching conversation that also gives insight into Thomas's practice, and we can talk about ancient feelings as well. So I'll start by saying, how are you doing, Thomas?
Oh, a deep question already. I'm doing very well. It's great to be here.
How does it feel being in Sydney?
It's good to be back. Um, I've kind of talked about my first trip here, which was on the way to Melbourne for the triennial over a year ago, and seeing the lawn and saying to my gallerist at the time, "Wouldn't that be an amazing place to put a sculpture?"
So you're saying you manifested that? Was that what happened?
I'm saying a lot of things came together perfectly.
I thought we'd begin the conversation by exploring your practice, and I want to start at the very beginning and your interest in art. How did that all begin?
Ooh, I was really lucky that my mother is an incredibly creative and inquisitive person, and she is fascinated by the world around her. And that might be a pebble on the street, it might be a leaf in the park, it might be the bark on the tree. I grew up doing rubbings on trees and finding the fascination in the world around me. And I think that connected me to a sense of wanting to touch the things around me and notice these small details, which I think we often can take for granted. And so if you can foster a fascination and feel a joy from the smallest, most elemental things and see the connection between things, it makes the world as just a really interesting place. And so I think that's the foundation. I always give a credit for that because I think it's important to acknowledge that. And obviously then, the kind of the individual things about me and my character kind of come into it. But it was certainly from my mother's intrigue in the world around her that she kind of fostered in myself and my brothers. And we'd go to museums, and so from seeing leaves on the ground to wonderful sculptures in museums, we could recognize the preciousness and the intrigue and the interest in all these different kind of things.
You, so I profiled Thomas for the Saturday paper. If you haven't read the paper this weekend,
It's a
pick up a
very good
copy.
article.
Someone's got a copy. Thank you. And in that profile, you talked about how you would go to these galleries and museums in London as a kid, and one of the things that really stood out to you was the fact that you weren't seeing yourself being reflected in those spaces. And I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit, like just that the fact that that made such an impression on you as a child that you were going into these public spaces and not seeing anything that spoke to you.
Yeah. I think that's about expectation, isn't it? And about being exposed to expectations about oneself and the value of who you are on just a fundamental level, not being above anybody else, but being recognized maybe as equal, maybe as somebody who contains, multi-layered elements of being human. And I think that was instilled in me again by my mother, but also I'm actually very grateful that my godfather is here from New Zealand. And I think it's being around people who recognize that in you and just present that to you as that's who you are, without any other sort of any other layerings or any patronization. And then it's just, of course you should be interested in this, or you could be interested in this. And so I was taken by my godfather Roger to orchestral practices and things like that. So I was shown parts of the world and shown elements of generally accepted culture, high culture, which really made me kind of feel very familiar with it at an early age. And I think that's really important in when it came to going to these institutions, these cultural institutions. I call them like cathedrals to culture, the museums and these galleries, and not seeing oneself reflected in a way that you're told is important, which is through portraiture, through representation, visual representation. And so I think there's lots of people in the world who are being told it's okay for you not to be seen because we are all human, and and you can look at that monument of that man atop a plinth with his foot on something that he's conquered, mine now, and you can take part in that. You can take pride in that. But when the reality of the history is being played out in contemporary society in your everyday through, I mean, there's no term for it when I was younger, these microaggressions. It didn't exist. You were just told you're oversensitive. And now we have terminology which is now being pushed back against. I was saying at the press thing that, my ambition has always been to be conscious. Like, what else are we here for if not to become conscious and fully engaged in the world around us? And then, that was termed woke, which used to be a good word. And now that's been sabotaged, and they've tried to corrupt the word woke to be conscious and try and make you feel like, you're almost criminal for doing that. It's a way to dismiss a way of thinking which can free you from the confines of the structures of power that exist.
I want to come back to that at some point, because I think that's an important point that you touch on. But I do want to go back to you as a child. So you're obviously being exposed to a lot of art and culture. At what point do you decide, I want to turn this into a career?
Pretty late on. I wanted to be loads of different things. I liked running around. I mean, that was my thing. I liked running around. I wanted to be in sports. If I was good enough, I would have probably done some sort of sporting activity. Again, my brothers were very good at sports, and they could have done that. But I realized very early on that I wasn't gonna be at the level that would get me any success, on a national, regional.
Well, you were dreaming big,
like
like
global scale.
wow.
Well, of course, this is it. Yeah. And I think, but that's I always dreamt big because I didn't realize that I wasn't supposed to.
Yeah, wow.
And so I've always been very grateful for my naivety, and I've been grateful that once I realized that people were trying to place me into these little niches where someone who looks like me, is allowed to flourish, which is generally below where they are. So I had a lot of people laughing at me, adults and children laughing at me when I would say what I wanted to be. And I can remember this even as my teenage years when I went to art school. And I said, I'm going to be an artist. And people were, well, but you don't become an artist. Like, it's too difficult. And I thought, oh, right. Well, I'll do it anyway. I'll have a go. I convinced myself that, well, you've got to at least try. Yeah. And why not me? Why not me? So as a child, I was naive, but I was also, I think, quite determined, if I'm honest. And when somebody told me I couldn't do something, if it resonated with the thing I actually wanted to do, I would prove them wrong.
You have proven them wrong. But speaking of your early work, I want to talk about some of your early work because we've got some images on the screen.
I can't see what's behind.
Oh, right. So there are two pieces of work that I'm an absolute favourite of your works, and they're pretty much your earliest works. And the first one is this image behind us of Licked. Yeah. And I want you to tell people about this performance work.
I'm so tempted to always joke about this work because when you look at the imagery, it is quite startling, and I can remember it very clearly. But I was very young. This was done in 2001. Haven't changed much. So Licked was a culmination of different thought processes where I realized that I was very interested in how we sense the other, how we sense one another, how we gain an understanding of the presence and the character and that energy that we share. And so I got very interested in the subconscious or the unconscious mind. And I would do works around subliminals and works that used rhythm and light and sound to try and induce states of consciousness or understanding in somebody, which I try to basically implant thoughts into people's heads. And this was a way of trying to push the boundaries of that. So the original idea, was that I would lick the inside of this gallery space and cover it in an invisible layer of my saliva. So the essence of oneself. And it was sort of, it was split between it being a performance, but then also the resulting installation. And so the performance element would be, you could go and watch this individual licking the walls of a gallery space through a plastic sheet. And I wondered to myself if people would sort of spread the rumor of this happening, so how far that would go. And then after the event, which would potentially have been sort of talked about, and people went into the room, how would they feel when they go into the room? So would they sense the sort of the residual presence of somebody through the biological trace? Would they disbelieve that it ever happened? And so I guess it was about using space, like energizing a space, activating a space to create a space where people could discuss their beliefs and also connect with one another, because you kind of like, oh, what's this? What's this thing here? Now, very early on, I'm talking about maybe less than an hour into it. And also, you don't realize how big a wall is until you put your face up against it. So I realized that this was quite a monumental task. And my tongue immediately stuck to the wall. So I had to start using a flannel and a bowl of water to try and lubricate the wall. But anyway, I digress. I began licking this wall, and I'd use my hands to frame out where I'd been because I couldn't see where I'd been. And that's the torture, because you don't quite know where you've gone. So how far you got? You look around, I've got the whole room. Anyway, I kind of progressed about a meter into this room, and I realized that I was like, I should have thought this through, because this wall is pretty dirty. Because I could see what I thought was the filler, the plaster filler, coming out and onto the wall. And then within about 25 to 30 centimeters across, and you think that I'm doing the whole up and down as well, I realized that it's getting dirtier and dirtier. And then I realized I could taste iron. And then there was a moment where I was like, oh, I'm bleeding. And so instead of being, oh my God, I'm bleeding, I was just like, oh wow, this is now a very visible piece. This has changed from this, the power dynamic has gone from me going, haha, is it, isn't it? You know, have I been here? To a very visible self-portrait of essentially the physical endeavor to try to connect to people.
That's kind of what it looked like. My other favourite work is this, Mixed Feelings About Bus Drivers. Mm. So Licked was very successful, and you could have continued with performance art, but you decided to change course. Why did you feel like you wanted to explore your practice outside of performance in that moment?
So for me, it's always been about the ideas. It's always been about asking a question and trying to be, ask the toughest questions possible, and trying to be as open to the honest answer as possible, and not be seduced by the reaction. So don't be seduced or dissuaded by the reaction, because it should, as an artist, I feel that my responsibility is to be truthful to myself.
That's a very kind of mature outlook for someone who's in their 20s, who's reached this level of success, to sort of go, hang on a minute, let me pull back. Even, do you know what I mean? Because most people would probably lean into that, because that's kind of, but that was like a very mature reaction.
I never wanted to be a champagne artist. And by that, I mean, I never wanted to just have people go, aren't you wonderful? And do the thing. So, basically entertain people for praise. Because I think that's a very short-term or a very limited pact to make with, a fictional audience or with a potential audience. Yeah. I will entertain you, you will praise me, and we continue this dance until you get bored and you get entertained by somebody else. So when I realized that, well, where do I go from there? Like, what do I do? Like, I literally was planning out things I could have done afterwards. And I had a moment where I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, this is just trying to be extreme for the sake of being extreme. And I was growing up at the absolute height of the slightly bloated success of the YBAs, who were everywhere in media, and my peers were trying to make work for Charles Saatchi, and it was the kind of the omnipresence of Charles Saatchi's selecting mood. Yeah. This was around everywhere, and everybody was trying to make work. Well, it felt like, from my perspective at the time, everybody was trying to make work to catch his attention. And I was like, well, that's not really my style. So I don't want to hang myself up upside down, cover myself in Vaseline and, squawk like a chicken. It's like, no, I don't. So, but what does interest me, and I was living, and I was very sensitive to my actual life, and the way I experience the world and my art are interlinked, and I guess whether or not I acknowledged that consciously at the time, it was certainly the motivating factor, because when people told me that being an artist is difficult, they weren't lying, but if you're doing something that you really believe in, if you're doing something that's connected to the core of who you are as a person, then you have a reason to keep going. Yeah. And so I realized that I was deeply interested in this idea of how we recognize one another, like how we get an understanding of the existence and the complexity and the fullness and the similarities of another person. Like, otherwise, are we going through this world alone? Yeah. Or are we all on this kind of crazy journey, sort of trying to find our consciousness, and how do these consciousnesses connect? Yeah. And so I got very interested in going back into the idea of the unconscious and the communication. So I started to get really invested in exploring how physiognomy and faces and movement, like blinking and eyes, connect to our way of thinking, and how that is then sort of manifested through our physical sort of interactions with one another, and what is the resulting experience of that? How does that feel? As opposed to just trying to be like academic about it, I was very interested in like, what's the real world feeling from this? And so I started to create stop motion animations, which was still really about me playing with space and sort of expanding time through the process of like frame by frame, and then compressing time again by playing it back at 24 frames a second. And also this inversion of scale, I'd use very small models, and then I would blow them up as large projections. So the small imperfections of like my thumb prints and stuff would come through, and so that people would not mistake them for people. So you wouldn't get into the uncanny valley, as they call it. You would very much be kept into this loop of awareness that you are watching an object become a moving object, which you then can invest your belief into, and potentially becomes something which you feel empathy for as it develops a sense of character, which you are giving it. And then because of the rudimentary way that it is sculpted and animated, you're reminded that you're watching an object becoming a moving object. So you're kept in this loop, basically. And as opposed to going, isn't that a hyper-realistic, cool thing? That's great, next. But I was aware that these 3-minute animations, which actually were recently played in Times Square, on the screens in Times Square, I was aware that people might just take them as an image. They might just pop your head in the dark room, take your head out again, and then go and look at the paintings. So I wanted to leave a strong image.
So animation, then you decide sculpture along the way.
Yeah. So I got into the Royal College based on my animations. I actually turned up to the interview with a big zip portfolio and a bag with a little projector in it that I borrowed from my brother. And I unzipped the portfolio in front of the head of the course, and there was 2 very successful artists. And I had a foam board with a CD cutout in it, and I popped that in as my portfolio. It was 3 animations.
Yeah, right.
And they asked me if I was on the right course. So yes, so the animation was really where my interest was, because it was so layered. But I was making these little experimental figures, these heads. I was sculpting heads as experiments into physiognomy. So what happens if you change proportion? What happens if you move an eye? These little the nuances, and how these nuances can have such huge implications for our understanding of what's in front of us, but also how gender affects it. And I soon learned, when I showed the first animations, how race impacts people's perceptions of what's in front of them.
And then you made this work, Mixed Feelings.
Oh God, I forgot it was up there. Yes, so Mixed Feelings about bus drivers. How did it go? So, all right, if we go back to the previous one, so it's a plaster head. It's got a bit of marble dust mixed into the plaster mixture. It's standing on that block which I picked out of the Royal College of Art's scrap bin. The MDF, shelf it's on is also taken from the scrap wood, and it's on the wall with one screw. And it was really my reflection upon and my critique of what is monumental sculpture and how should we think about portraiture, so the values contained within portraiture. And so I used fictional people because as I said many times on this trip, is trying to use fictional people to create real connections, as opposed to using real people to further potentially fictional narratives, or history as they call it. So yeah, this was really a small sculpture. It was placed low down on the wall, so it would actually make people's have to move around the sculpture. And again, that's me playing with space. It's on a large wall because I'm using space as an ingredient in our understanding of what the sculpture represents. And the materials are they're literally throwaway, because you can use non-precious materials to create a grand impact, or at least to create an understanding of what we expect in our monuments in terms of scale and material.
I mean, the reason why I love those two works in particular is that you can see a lot of the themes that your current work explores quite well. And, themes around power, for example, what gets centered, but also how the viewer is responding to the work, how they expect to respond, right? But then the other thing that you touched on, which I think is clearly articulated in both of the works, is your use of space. And I feel like both of these works kind of articulate that quite well. When did that become central to your practice? The way that you thought about space, how we explore space, and how we move through space?
I think from very early on. I mean, this is 2004. Licht was 2001. And I think even when I was late to studying art at school. So initially I wanted to be a physiotherapist. And so I was studying biology, which I had to chuck out because I was terrible at biology. So I took up art later on, which gave me a totally messed up timetable, which meant I had my own art classes were my own time. But I realized that even at that point, I was fascinated in just the spaces of the art room because I had it all to myself. And I would sort of almost create a personality for the space. And I think I grew up looking at art like from Jean Tingray, these mechanical works. Kinetic art was really fascinating to me. But I was also, when I was a very young child, I had a friend's father who'd teach me about booby traps. And so this idea of stored energy, this kinetic, the impact, the one thing leading to another, which actually ties into physiotherapy if you think about it, which I guess then it's a continuity when it comes to the idea of art and the kind of the things you put together to create certain impacts. So space it's where we are, but possibly if we're not just consciousness. But so this idea of space and getting a sense of oneself, a true understanding of one's presence and existence as a thing in this space that we only see through our brain, or understand through our brain. And then there are other entities out there, and then our the way that society structures this very almost unfathomable thing and labels it. So I think there's power in space. There's power in the way that we navigate space. I have an older brother who's an architect, and I always said, God, power hungry, power crazed, because you get to control how we live. Really, it's town planners, but you get to control how we live. And so I guess I'm just really fascinated by our experiences of the world, and space is the arena for that.
And the other thing that's actually quite that appears throughout your work is also scale. And so we go from this to these Windrush commissions.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could speak to scale and the importance of that in your practice.
I think scale and material and space are like three pillars of what I do and what fascinates me. And there's something undeniable about the impact, the physical and psychological impact that scale can have on somebody when understanding an object. The tenderness that something small can foster. You know, putting my hand like this, as if, you know, supinating my hand as if it's holding something. The way that the eye can envelop a smaller object, the way that it can pull you towards it to try and see exactly what it is. You know, mixed feelings about bus drivers. It drew people towards it because they wanted to get, you know, close up to the face. Now, larger works, they tend to work very well outdoors because we can see them from afar and we see them as a certain size. And then we get that sort of wonderful moment where we approach them and then the scale sort of tilts and then we realize that actually, oh, this is a big thing. And we're enveloped by them potentially. But the details open up. And so my way of thinking is that these large works allow me to deal with sensitive psychologies, you know, the non-triumphant, in a way that still gives them power and presence without them becoming pathetic.
Yeah.
That was an unsure one.
I want to talk about materials as well because there's so much that we really should talk about. By the way, audience, you have an opportunity to ask Thomas some questions towards the end. So if you've got a question, feel free to put your hand up and someone will come to you with the mic. Materials. I want us to talk about that because even with mixed feelings of bus drivers, you're using plaster. You said you picked up scraps of wood and you know it's put together with a single screw. And you're clearly making commentary there in terms of what gets memorialized, but also the materials that signify importance, particularly in sculpture. And similarly, the materials that you use for your large scale. And I wondered if you could speak to the deliberateness of that and what you're trying to say by using certain materials.
Yeah, when I was at college, Royal College, so doing my masters, we had access to a foundry. And I remember, I think I said maybe out loud to people, of course I'd never use bronze. I'd never use bronze. Why don't you know? That's what you know is out in the world. It's the obvious choice. But I used bronze to make a small little head, cast a small head whilst I was at college, and I put it to a side. I literally put it in a bag and forgot about it until I'd left. And I think because I was trying to process, I guess, that delicate balance of commenting upon power and a format of art which has a long history, so monumentalism and portraiture, without becoming that thing. Because often when I'd present these works, people would, you know, we want to go through life so quickly. We want to get from A to B, or sometimes just straight to B. And so people would be like, oh, so that's, and they would just give these people identities as if they were portraits. And I didn't feel at the time that that using bronze would help me make people aware of that. You know, it would just create more reinforcement of it being the thing that they think it is, where actually it's a critique of the thing that they think it is. And so it wasn't until I'd left college that I realized that I wanted to, in the public arena, so now more in the public arena, I wanted to really challenge the material of power. And I wanted to inhabit the material of power. And I wanted my characters, because they're becoming more sort of nuanced and more sort of, experimenting more with different types of people. At this point, they're still all male. I wanted to invest the time and the money into these objects that represent the people that I felt an affinity to and who were displaying these little nuances of, I call it courageous vulnerability. You know, like people often ask me, well, why are they not smiling? Couldn't they just smile? Because what, so that you feel more at ease? Like, because that's how I've had to live my life. Smiling so that somebody else doesn't feel uncomfortable. And so why would I spend my life making work that reflects the weight of oppressive expectation that I'm trying to push against? And so they're not smiling because they are free from the worry, if you like, of being observed. And they're free from the internalized need to reinforce those systems and processes by which we have to reassure.
Yeah. I mean, what I love about them is that they represent everyday blackness, like you say. They're not having to perform or be anything or be excellent. And so, yeah, you are placing these fictionalized characters of African descent in these spaces. Um, and when we were having the interview for the profile, you talked about some of the reactions that you get to the work. And I was very moved by one of the stories that you told me when you were installing the heads in Hackney. And I wondered if you could share that with the audience of that moment where you were like, oh, wow, I'm not just feeling it myself, but viewers must also be feeling what I'm feeling from having to make work that is representative to some degree.
Yeah, there's so many layers to that, because I'm laughing because I was like, it's funny to me that I didn't realize perhaps what I was doing would also be felt by other people. And like I said, this, the work I do is about how I feel about stuff, and it's a journey I'm trying to take with the questions I'm asking myself, and trying to be brave enough to listen to the answers. But it was 2017, and it was in the city of London. It was an outdoor sculpture show called Sculpture in the City, which I eventually actually became a selector on. But we were installing 3 aluminium heads atop marble plinths, and I think we were putting the final one in, the third one in, and I believe the two families who were together ran up with small kids about 7, 8 years old, and there was a little boy and a little girl among them. They were black, and they ran up and they were holding hands. I have a photo of it to prove it. And they were touching the face of this final sculpture going in, this big head, which is bigger than they are. And the little girl at the time just said, with this such innocence, like, there we are, there we are, as they were touching the face.
I mean, your work does have that effect. I think it is, I mean, just looking at it, I'm just going to fast forward because I want to talk about her. Yes, she's incredible. Got a lot of people talking, Thomas. Got a lot of people talking. It's interesting. I mean, obviously, hearing you contextualize the work and the questions that you're asking as you're creating these works and the things that you're trying to explore and make sense of in the world as you're moving and feeling the world, and creating these characters that you want to exist in the world on their terms, and everything else is being placed on them by the viewer. And so it's incredibly affirming work for a lot of people because again, one of the things that your work does very well is that you're placing these works in public spaces where historically works by people of African descent have been excluded. And so there's commentary there being made in terms of that absence, and obviously, the fact that people feel affirmed by that representation. But it also creates discomfort from some people who kind of wonder, why are these Black characters able to exist at this scale in these spaces? And what do you think about that? Where do you think that kind of discomfort comes from?
I mean, ultimately, it depends on who's making the commentary, like who is saying they feel uncomfortable. Some people just think that people like this shouldn't exist, out in the world, like minimize one's presence. And that's connected to various different attitudes they hold to what somebody who looks like that should be, or how they should feel about themselves. But it nearly always relates to how that individual feels about themselves, and the things they have, the ideas and the understandings and the psychological footholds they have laid out for themselves to feel stable, and to feel like, so that they know where their worth is. Because I feel like we've been placed into a system that has us constantly questioning our own worth, and using other people to assess who we are. And so, whilst there were so many people who loved this work, who said how it made them feel celebrated, whether or not they looked like that person or not, just the recognition of bringing into the lexicon of monumental celebration an image of a person like that was liberating for a lot of people. And for some people, it was truly challenging. And for some people who even look like that, it was truly challenging. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not their psychologist. But I do think it brought to the forefront the fraught anxieties and pressures that people are living with. And the way that we try to make peace with ourselves. The way that we try to say, tell ourselves a story, give ourselves a narrative, where if you just do these things, if you achieve these things, if you wear the right clothing, if you take the photo at the right angle to try to present yourself as a certain body type, if you get enough likes, if the person who dismisses you and hates you on a level that you will never be able to change, either ignores you or gives you, accepts your existence, then that's okay. And these things are so delicately balanced that, for me, that's just it's a constant state of anxiety. And so my work is, from the beginning when I started to work with people, has always been about challenging oneself. I don't make work for an outside audience. I'm not making sculptures of black people for white people to look at and accept. I'm making work which challenges the way in which I have constructed a value system for myself. Yep. And so, do I have to appear to be perfect? What does that image of perfection look like? Yeah. Who sets that image of perfection? Yeah. So, and how do we communicate with one another about how we feel? So, for example, in 2008, I did a series of small nude male figures in bronze, and they went to Chicago. And a lot of people were very uncomfortable about the nudity of these men and the way that they weren't being triumphant. And one person, I'll never forget it, he said, if you just put even like a gun in front. I just like, welcome to America. If I just put a gun in front of the genitals, that would be more comfortable. Yeah. But then I've grown up looking at sculptures of nude men and women represented through the Renaissance works, Greek work, Roman work, neoclassical works. So what's different about these? And there's only a few things that are different about what I do. So people kind of, they stumble upon the realization that they're not the same set of rules. Yeah. And without going on too long, but like if you look at the moments of representation, the moments of visibility, for somebody who looks like that, for a black woman of a certain size, it's minuscule. In a 12-foot bronze figure, well, I haven't seen it. And that's why I made it, because I haven't seen it. And why have we not seen this? Why should people feel it's okay to tell somebody they shouldn't exist? And more interestingly to me, why would somebody who looks like that feel so vulnerable about being visible? Because that's not at the core of who they are. Yeah. That's them feeling the pressure from a world around them.
Yeah, I mean, you've just touched on something there, and what I always find quite confounding in the ways in which some of the responses to your work, given that they are statues, but again, the things that black bodies have historically been subjected to, the surveillance, the policing, the fact that this reading is also being rendered onto your work is pretty extraordinary, because again, these are fictionalized characters, they're not representing everyone, but people are just mad. Like it's and so you sort of wonder, if you're having this reaction with statues, what reaction are you having with the actual human beings, right? Which I guess is why you're making the work, Thomas. These are the animations that you were talking about before, right? That were they beamed onto Times Square?
They were. So it's a project called Midnight Moments, and so from 3 minutes to 12 a.m., 3 minutes at midnight, the screens of all the advertising screens, which are normally incredibly bright and trying to grab your attention and sell you stuff and tell you should be thinner or more beautiful or wear this or wear that, they went black. And then from these screens, these faces emerged. And I would say it's a bit like having an eclipse in Times Square. And people thought that the screens had been hijacked. But given all the furore around the sculpture, this was very chill.
And then we get to her, this beauty, outside on the foreshore. Congratulations, she is just gorgeous. Ancient feelings. Yeah, why? I've asked you this question a few times, so by now I'm hoping you've got a succinct response to it. Why did you decide to place the head of a black woman on Sydney Harbour?
When people ask me, I always go, well, why not? I mean, we briefly touched on this, and it's not as simple as the answer I gave you, but it does include the origins of humanity look like this. Why is that so crazy? Why is that such a controversial thing? So why cannot somebody who looks like that be allowed to represent the understanding or the feeling of being human? Why do you have to look like her to feel her humanity, to feel a sense of care or empathy or intrigue or understanding of her humanity? It's a question, you know?
When I saw the images to the work before it was installed, I said this to Thomas. Megan, the curator who gave the introduction at the beginning, she shared the images, and my first reaction was I cried. And that was genuine. I genuinely cried because, you know, I have lived in this country my entire life, and part of the response for me was I very rarely get to see images of myself reflected in the mainstream at all. And you know, if they are the images I'm creating myself, and to be in an age where you get to see yourself in this way. I mean, I braid my hair so often. I know the feeling of like putting your braids in a bun. I love that they're like a little bit loose because that's just speaks to how I would wear my box braids. I love that her edges are laid. I'm like, she knows what she's doing. And it's so incredibly affirming. And I wasn't expecting to feel that way because I'm so familiar with your work. But there I was also reacting in that way. And I wondered if you could touch on the reactions that these sculptures seem to kind of elicit from people, which are
I, I guess I'm always trying to find the humanity when using material or using a visual. You know, the things I make are about trying to express a human presence and express that ancient desire to connect and to represent what is precious and what is human. Is that because of the Opera House? and and so I don't know what reactions people have, and like I said at the beginning, like I try not to be swayed or seduced or dissuaded by the reactions. But of course, when people tell me the certain reactions that they have, it means a lot to me, because this project was like over a year in the making, and it takes a lot of work to make that happen on so many different levels. And that's why with the Balnaves family and with the MC, I'm incredibly grateful, because these opportunities are insanely rare, because the expectation is that this isn't needed. There is no expectation. Why do you need that? Why do you need to be seen? Why do you need to be seen? You've got this. You've got me speaking for you. Why do you want a voice? Well, why can my voice not be part of your conversation? And so, moments of cultural significance or of visibility in an arena that is rarefied and is deeply understood to denote value. That image is important because look at the conversation. It's not just as a beautiful sunrise. It's that conversation between something which is globally iconic, which is universally welcomed, which is understood everywhere. I knew that image, before I arrived in Sydney. And now you cannot get away from the connection, from the association of that woman with this iconic thing. And so they share the same platform, they share the same space, and hopefully they share a similar significance in people's hearts and in people's understandings. And it just sounds ridiculously simple, but it's so obscenely rare that you're allowed to exist in those spaces without having to have achieved something which somebody else says is valuable enough for you to be present.
Just letting the audience know that I'll be opening it up to questions very shortly. So if you've got a question for Thomas, please put your hand up. I've spent a lot of time with her since I've been in Sydney. I've seen her a few times. I've seen her at sunrise, during the day, and at night. And the thing that has also stood out in spending time with her and thinking about what she's thinking, she looks out, is light. And I've noticed that you've been, I don't know if you've been thinking about light, but you've been posting a lot about light on Instagram. And I wanted to talk about that, and particularly when you are creating these big sculptures, how much you think about light, how much you think about how that shifts how you engage with the work, particularly for something like this that's very much out in the open.
I think about light a lot because also, I mean, so I wanted to be a director, film director when I was studying. Add that to the list of what I wanted to be. So it gave me an interest in cinematography, and there's incredible moments of cinematography in the film world. Look at Night of the Hunter, for example, which I saw in a cinema when I was at art school, and it blew me away. And I was just, it's a very vivid, like monotone film, and that's also reflected, or no pun intended, that's also present in the process of making sculptures, or modeling figurative sculptures at least, in that you model through shadow and light. And so the way that you would create crevices, or in drapery, for example, you can go around looking. It's the depth at which you create the model, which creates the intensity of the darkness or shadow, and that gives the impression of form. And so it's a academic and fundamental part of creating figurative works. Now, given my cinematic sort of slant as well, and the understanding of how work can exist out in the world, light becomes an incredibly important component to that. So I often work in silhouette. So when I'm using the black patina, for example, it's about creating an image, a silhouette image, which is so strong that it's a residual image in your mind once you've looked at it. And that also touches on my understanding of when I was doing animations, that people might pop their head in the room, have a look, go, oh, it's a face, and get out. But so I wanted to leave them with a strong impression of a face. And so moments like this, to be able to play with, it's such an incredible building. Moments like this, to be able to play with the environment, to be able to have that interaction of the space around a work, almost like the finger of God, kind of touching this thing, and the environment touching a work through the visible rendering, through the different light types. For me, is just another way to induce a certain feeling and to make people, I don't know, feel that moment, I guess.
It's all about moments.
T-shirt coming.
Thank you so much for coming out. And again, thank you to Thomas J. Price for this very incredible work. I hope you all get to spend some time with the sculpture. Bring your friends, bring your family, bring your kids. And yeah, thank you. And thank you to the MCA. Megan, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.